Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our mind. Good evening. My name is Joel Landy, and you're watching Songs of Freedom. Songs of Freedom is a show that celebrates the dignity of human struggle with its many faces and its many voices. Tonight's show is going to feature the voice of somebody who's running for president of the United States in the year 2000. His name's David McReynolds. Now, if you've been watching Songs of Freedom, you've seen David on this show before. We're going to be talking a little bit tonight about, well, foreign policy, domestic policy, what it takes to be a president, and who is David McReynolds? Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce to you David McReynolds.
Joe, I'm delighted to be here.
Okay, so you heard the agenda for this evening.
Very dramatic agenda.
Yes.
Don't ask me the names of any foreign dignitaries because I'm as bad as Bush, and I don't think I know who the Chancellor of Austria is.
Well, I supremely disagree with you. You're not as bad as Bush.
Actually, if you ask me to name the two oceans on each side of us, I can get those. I can also get the country north and south of us.
Well, that definitely helps. That's a lot more than he can do sometimes. But we're not here to be bashing candidates.
Actually, that has to do with foreign policy because we don't have we have an undefended border north and south and these two huge oceans. And you have to ask why we have a military budget of $350 billion.
Well,
what are we afraid of? Who is going to attack us?
I want to get into foreign policy in just a little while.
All right.
But first, there's a lot of people watching tonight who are very curious because I said that you're running for President of the United States. Can you tell everybody who David McReynolds is and why are you running for president?
Well, I'm the Socialist Party's candidate for president in this year. I ran once before in 1980 as a Socialist Party candidate. I've worked most of my life as a staff member of the War Resisters League, sort of a professional agitator. So that's my occupation, and now I'm retired, and so I have the chance to put my time to good use and run for president.
I've been doing a little reading about your background. You were influenced by Bayard Rustin and A.J. Muste. What influence did they have on you, and why is this pertinent in your life?
Well, Bayard was very influential. Bayard is a black radical who had gone from the Communist Party through to the pacifist movement, became a Gandhian, and then late in life, very sadly, from my point of view, shifted off to a neoconservative position. But Bayard was one of the most courageous people I knew. He taught me something about existentialism, and he taught me an awful lot about practical Marxism and a great deal about the black community in this country, the problems of race. Muste, of course, was one of the great radicals of the last century, which is already hard to say the last century, but from the 1930s, actually from 1917 on to his death in 1971. He was a Marxist at one time. He became a leader of the Fellowship of Reconciliation and was the person around whom the Vietnam protest movement coalesced, which he was active in until his death. And he was the major influence. If I had a mentor, I would say it was Muste. But many different people followed A.J. in many different directions, so that whatever I say should not be held against A.J. Muste.
All right, well, that's not why we're here. So, what is at stake in this election?
Well, I think a lot of things at stake. One of them is whether we have any chance whatever of limiting the power of the corporate structure and of democratizing our society. Most of you watching this have less and less chance of controlling anything in the society. The products you want are products that have been sold to you through television, for the most part, through the media. Your feelings about foreign policy are determined by sound bites. We keep resurrecting Adolf Hitler. One day he's Saddam Hussein, the next day he's Milosevic, then he's Gaddafi. And we respond in this way. We're willing to see bombs fall on each country as the occasion arises, because we just take the word for the government that this is the enemy of the day. So those are the issues that I think make the election important and make it important to people out there. I think the kids in Seattle and also in Washington a week in May demonstrated that there's a rising tide of opposition from youth, environmentalists, and labor people over the fact we don't have any real control any longer about the economy. And the control seems to be exerted by a fairly secret board of the international corporate structure. And that's very worrisome if you believe in democracy.
So we hear how good the economy is doing. What's your take on that? Are we being misled? I know I still know a lot of people who can't find a place to live and are looking for jobs.
Well, I think it's very good if you're in the upper income bracket. The chief executive officers in this country make, on the average, 400 times what the average industrial worker makes. So it means that if your father works at General Motors, that he has to work more than a year to make the amount of money that the CEO at General Motors makes in one day. So if you're in that upper echelon, you're doing fine. But if you look at the actual charts, we find that while those who are well off are better off over the last 10 years, no question about that. Those who are not so well off are less well off. That the jobs on offer are flipping hamburgers at McDonald's. The really well-paying jobs have been shifted out overseas or require college training, which people don't have. So it depends on where you are. It's what you think about the economy. Lots of folks are worse off today than they were 20 years ago.
And that would come as news to somebody who watches the news every day.
It would come as news to all of the people who are on the Talking Head show on Sunday morning, or who are talking, with who's the guy on Channel 13 that has Charlie Rose. I mean, you'd never know there was a problem in this country if you listen to the Talking Heads. But it's out there. It's a very serious problem, particularly in the Latino community and the African American community. It's a desperate problem where people are losing ground. And if you throw in the tragedy of the criminal system, where you have 1 out of every 151 Americans in jail, 2 million people in this country are in jail or prison as we're talking, then you get a sense that things aren't going so well. We now have the largest prison population of any country in the world. 1 out of every 4 people in the world who's in jail is in this country.
Does that mean to you that there's a business to be had in keeping people in jail instead of building schools?
There sure is, because the prison industrial complex is now privatized. You can make money off of jail. And even more shocking, because there's been a lot of complaint about China and its prison labor, we are now using prisoners to produce goods that are being sold on the private market, which means they're competing with union labor. So we have prison labor now. It's labor of people in prison making goods that are sold on the private market. That's called prison labor. We have it.
Who gets that money?
Well, in theory, the money goes back to the prisons, and some of it goes to the prisoners. So they can make some small amount, but it's way below anything approaching a union wage. So if you're a union man or woman, you have to really be worried about your job being turned over to someone in jail working way below minimum.
Isn't that the basis for workfare in this city?
Yeah, the workfare program is an appalling program because it should be paying union wages. When it doesn't pay union wages, you're undercutting the trade union movement. And you're lowering the living standards for everyone. So the workfare program is a very serious problem, that yes, everyone should have a chance to have a job, and of course we want jobs as opposed to welfare, because welfare isn't particularly helpful for people. You don't want a welfare society that endlessly people, work for welfare. But the jobs that they have ought to pay a union wage, ought to pay a living wage. I think one of the things that really bothers me, makes me deeply angry, is when I hear the term working poor. This is a very rich country. When you have CEOs that are making 400 times what the average person is making, we shouldn't have any working poor. We shouldn't have any poor, but certainly not people who are working shouldn't be poor. And so we need to lift the minimum wage very sharply and probably cut the work week also to spread that out. But we should not have working poor. That's an outrage.
Now, when I think of working poor, I also think about a person who has a job, who's working, who's just about paying the bills, and has a credit card or two, and every month has to pay out to keep that credit card. I was doing that for a number of years myself. So you're on this treadmill, and you would spend, and you're in that rut. So maybe working poor also has to do with the habits of people who just think there's something for nothing.
Well, I think there people have to be responsible, and that's always easier to say than to do. But the banks want you to have credit cards, so they make it very easy for you to get credit cards. But it's your responsibility. It's a free society, and you people who are out there who have credit cards should not just spend because because they'll raise the limit. If the credit cards start off with $1,000 credit, if you borrow more than that, they'll increase your limit, so it's $2,000. And if you pay regularly on that, they'll increase the limit to $3,000. So you can go thousands of dollars into debt as long as you keep making the payments, and the interest rate on that is appalling.
Yes, it is.
Yes. So but I think people have to take some responsibility for their own lives, and that's an easy place where they need to take some responsibility. But we have this whole commercial push that if you don't have the same size color televisions that your neighbor has, you're suddenly poor. And if you don't have the latest gadget, you're poor. And there I think we have the pressure of an industrialized, commodified society where our own values, our own sense of worth of ourselves is measured by how we dress, which is sometimes a good measure, what appliances we have, and whether they're as good as the people that we know. And it's a kind of a race to keep up with the Joneses. I remember that Quentin Crisp had a wonderful line when people would talk about keeping up with the Joneses, and he would say, "Never keep up with the Joneses, bring them down to your level." And I think we ought to take Quentin's advice on that.
So more isn't necessarily better.
No, it's not. What are you going to do with the more?
Well, that's a good question.
I mean,
but think about politics here for a second. Wasn't it true in '84 when Mondale ran against Reagan? He said, folks, we have limitations. We got to live with them. And Reagan said, there are no limitations. Meanwhile, over time, we built a tremendous deficit because people did not want to hear that we have limitations to live with.
Well, yeah, but Mondale's right, and as a socialist, I'm right in this case in saying we have limitations. We have limitations on things like gasoline. I mean, all of us complain about the price of gasoline, but the hard fact is it isn't high enough. Gasoline and oil are non-renewable energy sources. And if we're talking about passing the planet down to our grandchildren in better shape than we got it, we're going to really have to start cutting our use of non-renewable energy sources and finding alternative sources. But that's not popular. No one wants to hear that. I don't want to hear that. But that's the reality.
The reality is we're selling SUVs now in untold numbers, and mileage is terrible with those cars, but it's an armed vehicle rolling down the street, and people want more.
Yeah, well,
so how do you talk to people like that? I read somewhere that you said the future and our environment is our greatest challenge. You want to talk about that?
That sounds like an awfully slippery phrase. Did I actually say the future is our greatest challenge? I might have done.
No. You said this.
The future lies ahead of us.
The
environment, past is behind us.
The way we deal with the environment, the future is our greatest challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that we have very real limits. We have a growing population all over the world. The one thing, and it's sort of a painful thing, which stops the population growth is the increase of industrialization. And we've already reached the point in Italy where there's a negative population growth. Not only zero, but negative. And Japan, I think, also has now a negative population growth. These are highly industrialized countries. So as we industrialize the world, for whatever reason, we're never sure why, the population growth drops. But we don't have the resources to continue endlessly expanding the population. And we don't have the wood to burn, we don't have the coal, we don't have the oil. We've got to use solar power, we've got to use wind power, and we've got to use transportation that makes sense. Just a quick note, I've been out on campuses speaking during the campaign, and I found out that there are places that you can't get to. I went to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. You can't get there. You can take the Amtrak to Harrisburg, but from Harrisburg someone has to drive up an hour and pick you up and take you to the college and then take you back. And of course by then the train isn't running for another 4 hours, so you're stuck in Harrisburg at the train station. Then I went to a college in upstate Pennsylvania, and you can't get there. You have to fly to Buffalo, New York, and from Buffalo, New York, someone drives in from Erie, Pennsylvania, 2 hours to pick you up, take you to the college, and drive you back. And I thought, what happened 50 years ago? Did people sitting in these small towns say, let's build a city that no one can get to? Was this their thinking? Or were those cities built on railway lines, and we've closed the railway lines down? And I think if we're going to have to reopen the Amtrak and expand it all over the country, because that's energy saving, and we don't have it. We've destroyed that network of rail.
Yeah, well, my name's Joel Landy, and you're watching Songs of Freedom, and we're talking with David McReynolds, who's running for President of the United States. Let's talk a little bit about domestic policy in terms of what it takes to become a President of the United States or run for Congress. Finance reform, does it begin there, and what would you do about that?
Well, what I would do about finance reform is very radical, but then that's not a surprise. I'm a socialist member of the Socialist Party and their candidate. No finance reform is really going to work until you confiscate the enormous centers of wealth in this country. I'm talking about the people, not the people who have $1 million or $2 million. They can't do much damage, but those people who have 5 or 10 or 20 or $100 billion act as magnetic force fields on the whole process of democracy. And that money does have to be confiscated. They did not earn it. They got it through investments. They got it through good luck. In the case of Bill, what's his name at Microsoft?
Bill Gates.
Bill Gates. He got it through copying the Windows, the other system, the other operating system,
Macintosh. System, yeah.
But no one earned that much money. It's not physically possible to earn $10 billion. But it does have an enormous impact. You can buy newspapers, you can buy ads, you can set up foundations, you can buy colleges. There are 1,000 ways you can influence opinion without giving money directly to a campaign. The Socialist Party would confiscate those great wealth, those great sources of wealth. And without that, you're not really going to have campaign reform.
Where would that money go?
Go back to the government, go back for social programs. And then we could go to the Rockefeller family estate, and we could take people around it on a tour and say, you know, back in the 20th century, people had to live this way. They had these guarded fences, they had electrified fences, they had guard dogs, and now we've set them free. They're able to travel around the city without being afraid of being kidnapped, and we've set them at liberty.
What else do you see as major domestic issues here?
Well, I think that one of the greatest, most immediate issues is genuine health care for everyone. But in a sense, everyone agrees on this, just that Bush and Gore keep dancing around the one real answer, which is the single-payer plan, such as Canada has, where your doctor sends a bill to the government and doesn't bother with HMOs. The HMO multiple-level bureaucracies is much greater than that of Canada. And you have a real problem in getting people into hospitals that need treatment because they don't have an HMO, people who don't go to the doctor when they should because they don't have an HMO. So that's one issue. One issue is low-income housing, which cannot be done without government subsidies. I think, since I suspect most of you watching this may be in the New York City area, you ought to ask whether you want a city from which the poor have been driven by middle-income and upper-income housing. What is the life and vitality of Manhattan? It has always been the fact you had small communities of Chinese, Italians, Jews, Poles that were able to find low-income housing and gave great vitality to the city, plus students, artists, and yes, alcoholics, drug addicts, marginal people. If you drive all of these out of the city to suburb of Queens, you've destroyed the city. It becomes a Disneyland. It becomes a tourist visitor. And I think it's time for people to defend the right of poor people to live here in the city and to make provision for those by decent housing. And that can't be done without government funding.
Talk a little bit about all of this is a common thread to everything we're speaking about.
I'm just turning off my cell phone because I realized I forgot to turn it off and I don't want it to go on suddenly.
Yeah, I want to talk to you a little bit about technology in the 21st century.
I hate the cell phone. I forget to turn it on in the morning. I forget to turn it off in the television, but go ahead.
But I want to talk to you. You know, you and I are speaking in a public access studio. I'm not a millionaire or a billionaire. There's no commercial interest here. Nobody's making money out of this. But that's not generally the way people receive information in their lives in this country. Is that part of the problem as you see it as to why we don't have a representative society?
It's a major problem. It's a devastating problem. You've already watched the consolidation of networks and Warner and CBS, NBC, ABC, and the cables and so on. I'm lucky enough to get BBC because I have cable, so I can get your show and I can also get BBC every day. And BBC is not a left-wing broadcast. If anything, it's slightly moderate or conservative, very slightly, but it's actually broadcast facts. And I think that there are a lot of American journalists who would give their right arm if they could work for a program like BBC. PBS has let us down. Everything is sponsored by Mobil, Exxon. We need to revise PBS, get the commercials off of there, set up a framework such as BBC, which is really immune to congressional oversight, which is really free of the Democrats or Republicans or the socialists for that matter, set up a board that was able to do what the British have been able to do, which is to provide genuine news. Now, newspapers, nothing we can do except get the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, all of which, oddly enough, have good news. Their politics may suck, particularly in the case of the Wall Street Journal, but ignore the political page, look at the news page. But you're not going to get the news out of the New York Post. They just copied what they need out of the New York Times. And elsewhere in the country, what you're watching, and I know this because my brother works for the Miami Herald, the Gannett chain and the other one, the Knight Ridder chain, are already making very good money on their chains. I thought, naively, I thought that people working for newspapers or owning newspapers made 5% profit. No, they make 20% profit on their investment. But the management wants to increase that. And they're buying up newspapers and they're firing people, cutting back on coverage in order to increase their profit to 25% or more. Well, I think that's outrageous. And that's one of the problems of the free market. What it's done is to dumb down the daily media everywhere in the country. It's filled with advertisements and astrology and comics, but very little really hard news can get in there anymore.
And that's a big problem. And that reflects on everything we see and make decisions upon. We haven't talked about foreign policy at all. This show's rolling right along. I want to play word association with you now, David. And I'll say something and then you respond to it. So one of my complaints about things we see on television, and you are watching Songs of Freedom, I'm Joel Landy, I'm with David McReynolds, is that everything coming out of a candidate's mouth is scripted. There's no room left for anything that might have to be thought about or might take anybody by surprise. And surprise isn't necessarily a bad thing. It shows a person to be very human. So let's be human, okay? Some word association. Campaigns.
Funds.
Bush.
Oh, sad.
Cuba.
Should recognize it. That's not a word, though. That's a whole statement.
Television.
Enjoy it.
Politics.
Oh, interesting.
Healthcare.
Necessary.
Pentagon.
Appalling.
Democrats.
Republicans.
Guns.
Ban.
WTO.
Abolish.
Congress.
Large body of air.
Death penalty.
Abolish it.
Working class.
Everyone belongs to it, but they think they belong to the middle class. But I'm not doing what you're asking me to do. I'm being a politician. I'm sorry. I'll try to just do a word.
Okay. All right. Cyberspace.
Don't. Confusion.
Giuliani.
Control.
All right. Okay. Well, that's a very quick list, and the thing is, playing a game like that, people really see who people are.
Yeah, but it's so hard not to do a phrase. I failed the test.
Oh, I have another one association for you. Elian Gonzalez.
Home.
You want to talk a little bit about that? What was your opinion about this whole business about Elian Gonzalez?
I think if there's one thing that has earned Al Gore the right to be defeated, it was his intervention in the Gonzalez case. I don't want to discuss Fidel Castro, pro or con. I don't want to get into saying I'm not for Fidel Castro, but I got no buts about this. That kid has a loving father, and he should have been returned to his father from the beginning. The fact that his father, first his grandmothers came here, then his father came here, and as of the taping of this, he's still not been returned with this. He's with his father, but still hasn't been able to go back to Cuba. I think it's a real tragedy of this country. I think that the handful of, and a substantial handful of hysterical right-wing Cubans has managed to dominate Florida politics and also dominate national politics. It is time, in fact, to recognize Cuba, to get out of the Guantanamo Bay and end the blockade. But that has nothing to do with Elian himself as a little boy who became a football for Al Gore, for George Bush, for Fidel Castro too, if you want to put it that way, but Fidel happened in this case to be in the right. I think nothing was more shocking than seeing the right wing, and not even all the right wing. There were one or two Republicans, by the way, who to their credit said they believed in family values, the kids should go home. But I wanted to know where all these family value folks were when you had a real family value case, and that was the case of Elian.
Talk a little bit about what we should do internationally regarding China.
Well, I don't, first, I don't view China as an enemy. I don't favor admitting China to the WTO, but then I'm opposed to the WTO. The reason for opposing China is because it does not have free trade unions, and I think this allows unfair competition between workers in this country where there are trade unions, or Great Britain, or Germany, or Japan, and China where there aren't. So that's the reason for opposing China's admission. I'm not interested in her lack of political freedoms, because you start looking at some countries and other countries and, you know, what do you call freedom? And, you know, I'm critical, but I wouldn't start turning China into the Soviet Union as a bashing.
A lot of people are upset because of the policy towards Tibet as well.
Well, I think that's a good reason to be upset. But I wouldn't use that as a basis for excluding China from the WTO. I think you have to work with China. I think China is not the enemy. I think aspects of Chinese policy such as Tibet are wrong. Aspects of American policy such as our position on Cuba is wrong. But you try to deal with countries despite those problems. But whether you admit them to the World Trade Organization is a different question. But I think one of the things for Americans, Joel, to keep in mind in thinking about China is that this is the oldest civilization on the planet, and we need to be cautious in treating it as if it was just recently there.
Mm-hmm. David, we have about 2 minutes left, and there's so much we haven't talked about. Give us a brief description of what NATO is all about and your opinion about it.
NATO should be abolished. It should have been abolished way back in 1956 with the Hungarian Revolution, when it became clear the Russians couldn't invade anyone. And now we're trying to find new ways to use NATO. We've used NATO in the Balkans, and I think the thing to do is to abolish it. We don't have any enemies there, and we ought to get out of NATO, and we ought to, for that matter, cut the military budget by half for starters, and that would include getting out of NATO.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been watching Songs of Freedom. My name is Joel Landy, and I'm sitting here with David McReynolds, who's running for president. In the time that remains, I think one of the biggest problems we have is how to get a third, fourth, fifth party on a ballot. Well, how can we get a David? Now, this show does not endorse political candidates, but we do endorse the idea of more than two voices speaking for all of the Americans in this country.
That's the serious problem, and we have a ballot drive going on now in New York. People should get in touch with the website listed, or the email site listed, because we are fighting for ballot access here. We're going to have a very hard time getting on the ballot in more than 15 states in the country. We need to open up the ballot access and the debating access for the media for all the parties, left, right, middle, center, up, down, around, because you cannot have a democracy if you have it limited to two parties who agree on almost 90% of the issues. So it is a desperate civil liberties issue, which everyone out there should sign Socialist Party petitions and anyone else's petitions to get everyone on the ballot who's trying to be heard by the people. If I'm not on the ballot, then you've lost the right even to vote against me, in a certain sense. Right.
Well, if you want to do something about that, if you want to get involved, you know what to do. Get involved politically, and there's a website, www.votesocialist.org. Is that the name of it?
Yes, it is. It's not a website. Oh, it is a website. Sorry, it is.
Absolutely.
Yes, right. Sorry.
And let me just thank the people who make this show possible. I want to thank the people who make the show possible. Gloria and Jerry are in the booth tonight. Amy's on one camera, Molly's on another camera. And, well, for Songs of Freedom, and for everybody in our studio tonight, good evening. So, so you really want to turn the Pentagon into a hospital, do you?
Absolutely.
Is that going to happen in our lifetime?
That's what it was designed for in the first place.
No kidding.
Really was designed as a hospital.
Is that a story I don't know anything about?
No, it's an old story. Probably would have been a terrible hospital. The patient